Ann, thank you, and I want to thank the Society for inviting me. As Ann said, I'm a cell biologist. I think this is advancing it. There we go. I work on biological membrane structure and function, publish in journals like Cell, used to edit the Journal of Cell Biology, and things like that. How does somebody like me get involved in squabbles over evolution? And the answer is very simple. In a moment of weakness, you allow a former student to talk you into doing something absolutely insane, which is writing a series of high school biology textbooks. I'm an expert not just in writing these books, but also in the effects they have on young people. One of my daughters had to suffer the ignominy of using her old man's textbook for freshman biology in high school. It was an interesting experience. Joe and I have written our latest edition. It's been used around the country. And the opposition to the strong treatment of evolution in our books has been part of my motivation for writing a couple of books for popular audiences on evolution. One about evolution and religion, and the other, in a sense, about evolution and politics. What's the nature of the problem? Well, an indication of the problem is what I might call evolution denial. This is one of those slides you should never show to an audience like this one, because no one can read what's on the slide, but this is a survey of acceptance of evolution in 33 industrialized countries. If you said yes, you accept the evidence for evolution, you're in the blue. If you said no, you deny evolution, you're in the red. If you weren't sure, you're in that color in between. The highest level of evolution acceptance is in the Scandinavian countries, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden. I'm not sure you can find the United States on that chart, so I'm going to help you. We are right there. We are next to the bottom. The only country we beat was Turkey. And I found that significant when this came out, because I actually had a Turkish graduate student in my lab briefly in our graduate program. And I was sitting in my office one day reading this issue of Science, and I saw him walk outside in the hallway, and I said, Erkan, come here, you got to see this. So I showed him the article. He turned to the page with the chart. He located his country at the bottom of this list, and he put his face in his hands, and he said, I am so ashamed. And I said, come on, lighten up. What's the matter? He goes, we couldn't even beat the United States. You ought to think why that's funny, which comes around to saying it's not quite that funny. Now, why does evolution matter? I think evolution matters in a sense because, in a way, it is exhibit A for science denial in all forms in the United States, for what some people call science skepticism, which is applied to climate science and vaccine science and a host of other scientific issues as well. Now, there's probably no better example of this than a very famous court case that was engendered about 10 years ago in a small town in Pennsylvania called Dover, Pennsylvania, when the school board of that town instructed its school teachers to prepare lessons in something called intelligent design as an alternative to evolution. Well, the school teachers, brave souls, at the risk of losing their jobs, refused to do so. So the board, think about a board of education doing this, the board of education wrote their own lesson on intelligent design and instructed the assistant superintendent to go into the classroom one day and to teach that lesson to every one of the science classrooms. The next day, 11 parents showed up in federal court in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, filed a First Amendment lawsuit against the Board of Education, alleging that this was a violation of their First Amendment rights as Americans. What ensued was a remarkable 7-week trial. Some of you may have seen the NOVA program called Judgment Day about this. For those of you who haven't, I have a video clip which will come up now, and hopefully you guys can pick up the audio from the video clip. Here goes.
We don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
An extraordinary court case ignites a small town.
There's like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
And puts science itself on trial.
Very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
Nova reveals the story behind the headlines.
Anywhere you turned, we were getting attacked.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
And probes the question, is intelligent design a scientific alternative to evolution?
Properly the subject of a science class.
Or religion in disguise?
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
Judgment Day Intelligent Design on Trial on Nova.
Well, I apologize for the fact that something came up ahead of it and obscured the last of the video. I hope you liked the narration. I hope it was dramatic enough for you. This was an extraordinary court case. And as I say, it lasted for 7 weeks. It took an enormous amount of attention from the press. And this is actually the NBC TV courtroom sketch of me in the courtroom being cross-examined during the second afternoon of the trial. And one of the things that happened is during the 7 weeks, intelligent design literally collapsed as anything even remotely resembling a scientific theory. And at the end of the trial, the judge, a lifelong Republican appointed to the bench by President George W. Bush, issued his verdict. And basically everybody knew what was coming. And that was intelligent design simply was not science. This set off celebration in Dover, Pennsylvania. It was front page news and everything from the New York Times to USA Today. It was the lead story that night on all the nightly news shows. And as I say, the parents had good reason to rejoice in the fact that they were victorious. And I'd love to say that the forces against evolution had their day in court. There were national organizations involved in this court case. They had 3.5 weeks to lay out their case, and they failed in a spectacular way that literally everyone in the courtroom couldn't understand. But you know and I know that this case is not over. This situation is not over. Case in point, last year in the state of Texas. Texas is one of those states in which states' funds are used in a regular cycle to purchase textbooks and teaching material for students, and therefore they are subject to state approval. And what happened in Texas was that one biology book in particular was held up for special scrutiny because of its treatment of evolution. This happens to be the offending book. If you're near the front, you might notice my name on the cover. It was the book that Joe Levine and I wrote. And again, an education front page story in the New York Times that one biology book subjected to special scrutiny. And you might wonder, is this simply part of the usual dog and pony show in Texas? Well, it's not just Texas. It's an issue that comes up all over the country at local boards of education. Surveys show that the most frequently skipped subject in high school biology is in fact evolution. And teachers everywhere give it short shrift or soft pedal evolution, quite frankly, because they're afraid of the reaction. Well, what happened in Texas last year was that a single member of a voluntary review panel looked at our textbook and said it had 20 serious errors in the text. In the Texas review process, error is a buzzword. An error is a mistake that may be and must be corrected by law. That person, took me a while to find out, was an engineer by training. His name was I.D. Trotter, and he submitted a document detailing what he regarded as those 20 errors. Every one of them, surprised to say, was on evolution, and what he suggested in each and every case was a rewrite, how we should change the text. And in each case, every one of those changes would have cast doubt on the scientific validity of evolution and, quite frankly, on the honesty of the entire field of evolutionary biology. So how do you respond to that? Well, what Joe Levine and I did was very straightforward. We knew that the motivation of this particular critic and his many supporters on the board was religious in nature, but in fact the objections themselves were presented in the guise of science. And therefore it was appropriate to answer them one at a time, point by point, with scientific information. So I spent several afternoons doing exactly that, putting together a very detailed report with scientific citations and diagrams and explanations, explaining in each and every case why the criticism was wrong. I would have thought that would have sufficed for the Board of Education. It didn't. They decided, and you might have heard this before, oh my goodness, we're not scientists. We have to send this out for further review. To my delight, they basically did send it out to 3 authentic biologists from institutions like the University of Texas and Baylor and Texas A&M. And what happened as a result is they looked over these and they very quickly decided that none of the mistakes were actually mistakes. It was the criticism that was in error, and as a result, our textbook, highly disputed, cleared expert review. Those biology lessons stayed, and in fact, in the eyes of some of our textbook competitors in the state, we got an enormous amount of free publicity, and in fact, actually won favor with many teachers. So I can smile about that in retrospect, but being asked over and over again to defend the central idea of the biological sciences surprises me. It probably shouldn't. Now, I'd love to say again, this was a victory, everything is cool. We now have wonderful teaching material, not just from us, but from other people in the hands of students in Texas. But the political climate of anti-science remains. The National Center for Science Education quite justifiably put out a report, said final victory in Texas. They were right. But in the elections last year, the 4 candidates vying for lieutenant governor all came out for teaching creationism in the school. Lieutenant governor's position in Texas is not a figurehead. It's a very powerful position. It's a stepping stone to much higher office. We're going to see this as a continuing political problem in years ahead. So from this episode of responding directly, answering in a forthright way, and ultimately winning over your critics, you might say that what I'm going to tell you today is to take every challenge head on with an uncompromising rebuttal of each and every anti-science argument, and to do so in every possible venue and forum. And here, for example, I am in such a venue and forum a couple of years ago, taking on, you might say, a pseudo-critic discussing the series of evolution. Incidentally, if anybody asked, this was the shortest 6.5 minutes of my life, being on Stephen Colbert and being grilled about evolution. But that is not exactly what I want to say, because the entire issue, and we see this in climate change as well, is more subtle and requires a deeper level of sophistication. It's tempting to take images like this and say that the source of the problem of opposition to evolution and other elements of science is pure ignorance. So more information will generate greater acceptance. And I brought this slide, which is from a church in Florida, precisely because I've been asked that question in public talks over and over again. If we evolved from apes, why are apes still here? And I thought I would tell you my stock answer to that, which is to tell the person, I'll answer your question in a minute, but first I want to ask you a question. Where did Protestants come from? And usually the person looks at me and says, what? And I said, come on, you know, the 96 Theses nailed to the church door, Martin Luther, Reformation. They said, oh, I guess Protestants came from Catholics. And then I say, are Catholics still here? Now you have the answer to why apes and monkeys are still here. And we can go further if you like. But I want to talk about this logic of just give them more information, which, as you've heard, we often apply to climate change as well. Not long after after the trial in Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum, former senator from Pennsylvania, made explicit what many people make implicit, which is a link between evolution and climate change by labeling them as dogma. And dogma, of course, is not science. So by tarring them both with the same brush, he wanted to link them together. Now, I've been actually asked about climate change repeatedly. I'm not an atmospheric scientist, but I run across claims that many of you do as well. One of which is that global warming stopped back in 2003, and we're currently sitting on a plateau, and therefore everything's cool, and there's nothing to be worried about. Well, the answer is not exactly. Now, not being an atmospheric scientist, but being trained in science, I often say, well, let's look at something else. And that is, most of the surface of this planet, in fact, is not land, but water. Water has a heat capacity about 3,000 times greater than the atmosphere itself. There's the heat capacity of air. There's the heat capacity of water. If climate change is really happening, we ought to see that signal in the ocean. So what is happening in the ocean? And as I'm sure all of you know, every single measure of ocean heat constant shows persistent increases, not a plateau, and the trend is very, very clear. And furthermore, this trend shows absolutely no sign of slowing down. So what does this mean? And it means something in a straightforward way. There are two ways to look at this. One is, as the oceans warm, Solid water in the form of ice begins to melt. That contributes, if it comes off the land in glaciers, to the volume of the oceans. But more importantly, when you heat up water, the volume of water itself expands, and therefore we should expect to see sea level rise. And lo and behold, every measurement of average sea level has shown change, consistent change, dating back to the beginning of the 20th century. And I think it's very simple in terms of building public support for an appreciation of climate change and the need to mitigate it in coastal communities in particular, to ignore where the science comes from and simply say the seas are rising, we've got data that shows that, how are we going to cope? And I guarantee you that people in coastal communities, liberal or conservative, all along the Atlantic have seen this and seen this repeatedly in recent years. But as we know, information doesn't always mean acceptance. Views on climate change, and I'm sure most of you know this, correlate very strongly with political self-identification. These bar graphs, and again, the text is too small to see, show whether individuals accept climate change as being human-caused. If you're liberal, most liberals do, very few conservatives do. If you say there is no global warming, that correlates very strongly with conservative political identification. And one possible conclusion from this, a wrong one by the way, would be that conservatives are stupid and don't understand the data. That turns out not to be true. And in fact, in a recent study where people who rated themselves as liberal, moderate, conservative, and in between were asked, what is the principal gas that contributes to climate change? A lot of them didn't know. And it turns out that knowledge that CO2 and methane were those principal gases is slightly higher among conservatives than it is among liberals. So therefore, this is not an issue of not having the right information about basic science. Now, the interesting thing is the same is true with evolution and for a cosmological idea like the Big Bang. Correlation is much stronger with religious belief than it is with scientific literacy. And in the case of both evolution and the Big Bang, we see the strongest acceptance among people of low religiosity and the strongest rejection among people of high religiosity. We don't see the same level of correlation with measures of scientific literacy. And that also indicates it's not scientific literacy as the problem. So what's really going on? This is an article that appeared 2 years ago in Nature. It was written by a professor of psychology and law in Yale Law School named Dan Kahan, talking about why this divide in understanding and acceptance of climate science exists. And as you can see, and this is excerpted from the article, he talks about the fact that for members of the public, being right or wrong about climate change on a personal level has no impact on your own personal life. However, the impact of taking a position that conflicts with your cultural group, people you hang out with, people you make institutional connections with, people you respect, that can be disastrous. And he suggests, therefore, that there are cultural issues which are associated with this. And he expounds upon this. If you take the wrong position in relation to your cultural group, it can be disastrous for you personally. Therefore, what should we expect a rational person to do? We're scientists. We're rational people. Well, the answer is to engage in information that is geared to forming and persisting in positions that are dominant within your own cultural group. And therefore, Kahan says just piling on information is not going to work, and I agree with him. This is an article that appeared very recently in the American Conservative, which is a very interesting online magazine that often gets it right with respect to understanding where certain cultural currents are going. And as you can see, this is the summary of some of Kahan's work and others. As the level of scientific comprehension increases, individuals with a secular identity are more likely to say that they believe in evolution. But those with a religious identity, as they become more scientifically literate, they become even more likely to say they don't believe in evolution. And given a high level of scientific literacy, they can tell you reasons why that is the case. So what does this mean for evolution education? And besides my research work, I'm somebody who's spent a lot of time trying to think about how do we explain evolution to young people, how do we turn them on to this remarkable area of science. Well, one possible interpretation is that it's all pointless, that you can't educate people into believing in evolution. Although as a scientist, I don't like the word belief in that sentence whatsoever. Nonetheless, that turns out to be an issue. Now, to some extent, I would argue that that is true. Here's what Kahan says. Who should we blame for the climate change crisis? And by crisis, he means the crisis of acceptance. To borrow a phrase, it's the science communication environment, stupid, not stupid people. We make a terrible mistake if we think that the critics of science are inherently ignorant and uninformed. And he says trouble starts when that communication environment fills up with what he calls toxic partisan meanings. Meanings that basically tell people, if you are one of us, believe this. And if you don't believe what I say on the basis of authority, you are one of them, meaning a hostile group. And overcoming this dilemma, and I like the way Kahan puts this, requires strategies that protect the quality of the scientific communication environment from the pollution of potentially divisive cultural meanings. Now, it might be difficult to say what this means with respect to climate science, but with respect to evolution, I think I can tell you right away. Should we assume that attitudes about the history of our species, such as where did we come from two individuals who lived 6,000 years ago, or from a process of evolution, if we assume a defeatist attitude, that these attitudes can't be changed, that would consign science education, both formal in the schools and informal out there in the real world, to failure. I'm more optimistic than that. This is from a study published a few years ago. It's a very detailed bar graph, and what it shows is level of acceptance of evolution correlated with three things really: level of education, political belief, and also acceptance of religion. And over here are people with high school education, college education, and grad school education, all self-identified as fundamentalist Christians. On the right-hand side, same three categories: high school, college, grad school, not fundamentalist. The three colors on the graph: blue, conservative; red, moderate; and yellow, liberal. And you can immediately see acceptance correlates with liberalism. It correlates with not being a fundamentalist Christian, but it also correlates with level of education. And to me, it's particularly significant that this same correlation with level of education applies to self-identified fundamentalist Christians as well. The more education they have in general, and in science in particular, the more likely they are to accept the science of evolution. So the key point is, even among fundamentalists, whom we should never write off, more education equals more acceptance of the basic science. Now, group identity, to whom one belongs, and all of us have a group identity too, I would say is defined in two ways. One is a set of core beliefs, and the second is a shared culture. They're not the same thing. Now, fundamentalist Christians and evolution deniers do have a set of core beliefs about human origins and other matters, but they also have a shared culture of values. Just as within the scientific community, we have a shared culture of values as well. If we assume that the problems are these core beliefs, and we attack them, unaware of the culture in which they exist, I think we're going to fail. And the reason for that is, as scientists, we come from an outside cultural group that can easily be perceived or identified as being elitist, arrogant, and even hostile to people of faith. And when I speak to non-scientific groups, I always know at the beginning, that is how I am going to be perceived. So how do we overcome this problem? And the answer from Kahan, which I endorse, is that we have to get at these messages from inside the cultural perspective of the group that we hope to convince. And the way in which I begin is with the insight that Western science developed amid the cultures of Abrahamic monotheism. Here are two individuals, one Christian and one Muslim, identified as the founders of the scientific method itself. And in each case, they were convinced that applying the scientific method would give greater glory to God. This is a fact that is often lost in today's culture wars, where you see cartoons like this. Here's a candle. The candle is labeled science. There are shadowy figures in the darkness saying, hit it with your Bible. And that sort of stereotype is something that I think most of us in the scientific community can relate to, but assuming such hostility in a cultural sense is self-defeating. And I'll try to explain why. And as a result, there is shock and even surprise when someone like Pope Francis endorses ideas like evolution and the Big Bang. I was called up by 2 national magazines who said, isn't this an incredible surprise? What do you have to say about it? And my quick answer was, this is the least interesting news story of 2014, and I will tell you why. Is there a way to present ideas like evolution and the Big Bang to people of faith? Well, let me start with a quiz, and this is how I often start when I talk to religious audiences. Who's the person who developed the mathematical foundation for the Big Bang? Maybe it's the guy depicted in that picture. Well, the answer turns out to be no. It's the guy standing next to him with the Roman collar. The person who first showed that general relativity supports cosmic expansion was, in fact, a professor of mathematics and physics and a priest that you can see right here, named George Lamont Ray. And the fact that Father Lamont Ray was the early pioneer of, in fact, cosmic expansion and the Big Bang shows, in a sense, that he is in keeping with the very tradition of religious thought in the Christian world. So it's not at all surprising that the Pope would endorse Big Bang, when in fact it was a Catholic priest who first worked out the mathematical and physical basis for it. Now, I should tell you, in this respect, and this is what I told those magazines, Pope Francis is not an exception. Pope Benedict years ago was asked about evolution as well, and he said this: the contrast, the apparent conflict between evolution and God is an absurdity, because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution that appears as a reality that we must see and enriches our understanding of life and being. That sort of complicated Pope speak. If you're confused by that, do what I do. Go to that publication that, for me, always clears it up, and you know what I'm talking about. It's the New York Post. Evolution and God do mix, Pope. End of story. So, how should we approach religious groups talking about evolution? My answer is in the context of their own cultural values. And here's how I do it. I point out that life is material. If you need proof of that, remember the phrase dust of the earth, which comes from the Bible. The capacity for life is built into the physics and chemistry of matter. Evolution, therefore, is an inherent and predictable part of nature. It's not a mistake. And if you are a religious person, then the ultimate cause of the natural world is, in fact, the will of God. And if that's true, then evolution reflects nothing so much as God's own creative power. So in a very real sense, there is an evolutionary design to life that's part of the fabric of the natural world. And my lesson as a biologist is the capacity for evolutionary change is built into nature. And this allows believers to understand it as part of God's providential plan. This is an attitude that many scientists hold as well. This is Simon Conway Morris, a very distinguished paleontologist and also a Christian, who's written a remarkable book called Life's Solution, arguing that convergent evolution made almost inevitable the emergence of intelligent, reflective, self-aware life like human beings. Now, a couple more things. I don't think that we have to distort the science of evolution to insert God into it. I would be against any effort to do that as a scientist. And the reason we don't have to do that is because if you are a person of faith, the process itself is part of the natural world of God's own making. And therefore, the hand of God is built into nature itself. And for Christians who say, what kind of God who could exist in a scientific world in which nature acts according to predictable laws? The answer is a God who fashioned a world that is rational and intelligible. So to people of faith, we should emphasize that God is not the antithesis of scientific reason. Rather, people of faith can understand Him as the reason why scientific reason works in the first place. And there are organizations like the BioLogos organization and the Clergy Letter Project that have sought acceptance of evolutionary science among religious Christians. And they do this by respecting the competence of science to investigate the world, by regarding Scripture as a spiritual and not an empirical document, by not insisting that science proves God's existence, which I think is a hopeless quest. And the insight that they gain from this is God is not in nature, but properly is understood as the reason for nature itself. And I always emphasize that a faith, any faith that requires the rejection of science is not a faith that is worth having. Now I want to point to a couple of studies, one in particular that shows that bringing religious students into the culture of science basically promotes acceptance of evolution in a religious university environment and a secular one as well. This study was carried out at Roger Williams University, which is a secular institution, and Providence College, which is a religious one in the state of Rhode Island. And what they did was basically ask students during their freshman, sophomore, and senior years, should creation be taught alongside of evolution in schools? First-year students in both schools say, yeah, pretty much. About half say evolution only, about 40% say both. By the time they get to their senior year, lo and behold, almost 80% of the students say evolution is the only explanation that is scientific. Now, have students changed their mind because they're losing their faith? The answer turns out to be no. Not in students in science, technical, and mathematical fields. It turns out for them, the perceived importance of religion goes down, but religious service attendance actually goes up among students of the sciences in both of these surveys at the same time that they are increasingly acceptance of evolution. And basically, what students do, essentially, is to accept the science of evolution alongside their religious beliefs. And if you're interested, the real majors in college that result in a decrease in religious faith are in the humanities and social sciences, not in the natural sciences. And you can make of that what you will. So, what are the lessons I want to draw from academia? One, highly religious people are the least likely to accept evolution, but you knew that. Two, cultural introduction to science produces far greater acceptance than a confrontational means of posing the question. Students abandon the idea that these ideas are in conflict as they move through their college years, and these changes occur in secular and religious institutions alike. My bottom line is pretty straightforward, and that is I think we can increase the acceptance of scientific concepts by appealing to the cultural values of religious groups and letting them see that science respects and endorses those cultural values, such as truth, humility, honesty, and above all, absolute wonder at the grandeur of life, which is something that every biologist I know shares. Thank you very much.